Hey, I'm Pat, and in this video I will be going over some basic constraints in Roblox Studio. Basically like linear velocity, align position, align orientation, angular velocity. Nothing too crazy. I didn't want to go over like too many things for one video, but yeah, so pretty much just Roblox physics, which isn't really fun to play with, honestly, but you know, it can be useful for quite a few things, like moving platforms, coins, like some visual animations could be made with constraints like these, which is pretty useful. I'm also going to go over Weld, I think. Not much to really go over with Weld, but we'll go over it kind of quickly. So anyways, what I got right here is linear velocity. So the way linear velocity works is it pretty much applies a force in a singular direction infinitely, pretty much. So it'll infinitely go off in one direction at the velocity that you give it. There's a few different ways, like different modes. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know what line or plane really how that works, but vector, I understand how vectors work. So the way vector velocity works is, you know, it's just a vector 3. We got 3 axes here, and whichever one you give it velocity on is the one it'll move on. So I'll move in that direction. If you want to say like move in a direction a player is facing, you could use the player's look vector and pretty much multiply that by maybe like 3000 or something, and that will give you like velocity in like 3000 studs per second in the direction the player is looking, pretty much. So all these constraints are actually attachment based, so you're going to actually need an attachment. So you can see in this part I actually have an attachment. Attachment's just like this little circular thing. If you go to model, we can go to constraint details right here, and we can turn that on, and we'll actually show you the pretty much like all the constraints and like what exactly they're doing. You can see our attachment is this little green ball. It kind of highlights it for us when we hover over it, and our linear velocity is this kind of like line, you can see. So it's pointing up because that's kind of the velocity we have given it right now, right? And we have linked it to this attachment by using this property. So we click on this, and you can click on attachment to kind of link it to that attachment. This is just like a reference to another instance, so we're just pretty much referencing this attachment in this property. So if we were to say access this property in a script, we could do attachment 0 dot name, which would actually be A0's name, which would just be A0, right? Or we could do attachment 0's world axis, whatever. So I guess I should go more over how attachments work exactly. So attachment is pretty much has a position based off of its parent. So its position is not actually a world position, however, it's kind of based off of its parent's position. So if we were to say move this over a little bit, you can see its position is now 1.2, but if it's at the middle of the part, its position is 0, 0, 0. However, if we want to get its world position, we can actually still do that through world position, which is just a property that it has. It also has a C frame if we want to use that as well. I believe you can rotate these. You know, you see they kind of have an orientation as well, right? Anyways, I'm also going to go over a weld now. So say if we took this part and we duplicated it, and we don't actually want it to have another linear velocity, well, we want these parts to move the same. If we test it right now, you'll see just that part moved up. This part's still stuck down here, even though they're welded together. Another thing to keep in mind is none of these constraints will work unless the parts are unanchored. So they can't be anchored in order for this to work. So you can see both of these parts are not anchored. So how can we connect these two parts without anchoring them, right? So a good method for this would be a weld constraint. And the way a weld constraint works is it just pretty much connects two parts together. Even though that they're not anchored, it pretty much makes it so they're acting as the same part, pretty much. Like any velocity applied to our part will move both of the parts. So it pretty much like connects them both. It welds them together. If you know what welding is, right? It pretty much just welds them together, connecting them, which is something used for tools, right? So you can see now they're moving together, a little bit wonky, but it still gets the job done, right? So in tools, usually you'll want to weld the parts in a tool together to keep them together without anchoring them, because if you anchor them, then obviously the player will get anchored with that tool once you weld the handle to the player's hand. Because if you don't know, when a player equips a tool, there is a weld created between the tool's handle and the player's right hand or right arm, whatever, depending on, you know, the version you're using, whatever, right? So that pretty much connects the handle to the player without anchoring either of them, because the player also works off of physics, so the player isn't actually anchored. If it was anchored, then he wouldn't be able to move. So next one is align position. So you can see we got a little bit of an arrow here, and it's kind of drawing a line in between these two attachments here, and it's pointing upwards because we are aligning our position to this attachment pretty much. So we'll go over align position now. So the way this works is we have two parts. We could theoretically just have two attachments instead of one part, but it wouldn't work too well because the attachment actually move with the part, so the part would just kind of be infinitely moving, right? So this part up here is actually anchored, and I actually have its can collide off, which prevents this part from pretty much having physical interactions with this part. And that kind of like keeps it from glitching out once it reaches there. So it allows it to actually reach the attachment. And obviously align position, as its name implies, it aligns its position with an attachment. So there's a few ways you could use this. You could use one attachment or two attachment. I'm not sure how one attachment works. I don't have much of this memorized, I'm sorry, whatever. I'm just teaching you what I know, alright? But the way two attachment works is A's attachment 0 is the attachment that you want to move. So that's the attachment that you want to align. And then A1 is pretty much your goal. So that's where you want to move your attachment 0 to. So A0 is pretty much the attachment that you want to move, and then A1 is the position you want to move the part to, or whatever, right? Then you also got force, or max force, and max velocity. I have these both at math.huge or infinity, whatever you want to call it. If you just press 1 and hold 0 for like a while or whatever, it'll pretty much autocorrect to infinity, whatever. It's not actually infinity, but it's okay. And then you got responsiveness, which pretty much tells you how fast this part is going to respond to the align position. So we can actually limit its force kind of with responsiveness by limiting how fast it moves, which is why even though its max velocity is infinity, it still moves kind of slow because its responsiveness is only 10, right? Now if we want to do something like rigidity enabled, what this does is it pretty much gets rid of all those values we just had, and it makes the part pretty much forced to move towards this part, and it'll use the maximum amount of force and responsiveness possible to make it move and align its position as quickly as possible. Pretty much meaning that it will pretty much lock its position to that attachment. So now you can see, right, now it's kind of, it moved a lot faster, right? And if we wanted to, what we could do is we could target the part with the half transparency, which is our part that it's supposed to move to. You can see as we move it, the part actually follows pretty well. It's like almost like the part is welded, even though we don't have a weld, which is pretty useful if you wanted to do something like make a part anchored without actually anchoring it. You could use align position with the rigidity enabled to pretty much lock that part in a specific position, because even though if you use a weld, that would actually make the part anchored because the part that it's welded to is anchored, right? If that makes sense, hopefully. So you can see over here now, this is getting a little bit more complicated because you notice that this part is actually floating in air, but it's actually still using constraint That is because I'm using multiple constraints here. I'm using align orientation, I'm also using align position. So what align position is doing is pretty much keeping this part in the air. It's kind of keeping it locked onto this, and this actually has rigidity enabled. There's also some other ones like reaction force enabled and apply center of mass. I'm gonna be honest, I just read what reaction force enabled does. I don't remember, but you know, you can always look it up if you really need to figure it out a little bit better. But so we got an aligned position, pretty much welding this part in place without actually using a weld or anchored, so it kind of keeps it in the air. And then we got align orientation, and the way align orientation is obviously a lot similar to align position, where it pretty much just wants to align its orientation to be the same. So we got here, it's pretty much the same thing, where attachment 0 is the part that you want to change its orientation, and attachment 1 is the orientation you want to change it to, or the goal, right? And right here, it's kind of similar, where you have responsiveness and torque, and you also got angular velocity. I just set angular velocity to infinity, and just kept its responsiveness at 10. Torque didn't really seem to matter too much here, but you can see once I play it, it slowly rotates to kind of fit to match, right? You can see this one over here, we actually got an angular velocity. And what an angular velocity does is it's kind of similar to linear velocity, where it'll pretty much infinitely cause, or it'll make something infinitely rotate in one direction. So it's similar to how it has a vector 3 in here, which controls which direction you want to rotate in. So we got rotating on the y-axis at 35 studs per second, and we have its max torque limited to 35. If we wanted to, we can make this maybe 1,000 or 10,000. I didn't count, but if we do that, you'll see it'll start kind of accelerating, getting faster and faster, spinning faster and faster, right? We're also obviously using align position to kind of keep it in the air here. So now say if I wanted to here, I'm gonna actually do this. I'm gonna put this down here, right? So now say if I get my player out, or no, that's not my player, I'm stupid. Alright, if I get my player out, and I probably should have lowered the max torque on this, but if I get my player out and stand on this, you'll see I don't rotate. And the reason for that is because I didn't fully think this through, but the actual reason for that is because this part doesn't have more mass than my player. So it doesn't have the ability to pretty much influence my player's velocity, because it's actually kind of too light. So the way we're going to change that is just by making the part bigger. So if we do this, this will make the part bigger, therefore having more mass, making it able to influence our movements more. So I'm going to actually limit this torque down to 100, so it's not too crazy, but I made it a lot bigger now, right? So theoretically now, if I stay on top of it, you'll see my player moves with it. And you can see now that it's bigger, you can see the angular velocity actually has a lot less impact on how fast it spins, because it's a lot bigger, so it takes a lot more force to move it, pretty much, right? So you can see it kind of worked. I also believe, yeah, and you can see my player also creates friction, kind of slowing it down. So if I stand off of it, you can see it speeds back up again. But if I get on top of it, it kind of slows it down because it's kind of making it heavy. It's having a hard time turning, pretty much, right? So that's kind of how that works. So if we wanted to have maybe like a moving platform or something, we could use align position to kind of move the player with them, as long as we got enough movement, right? So there's not much scripting involved here, right? Theoretically, right? All this is pretty much not using scripts. But what I have made is a platform moving thing over here. And what this does is it moves a platform back and forth, using align position, of course, right? And what it does is it moves the platform back and forth. I kind of spoiled how you do this already, but it doesn't matter. So I stand on top of it, and you can see it moves back and forth. This is kind of a very common thing in obbies, and you have to like jump between the moving platforms or whatever, something like that. I can go ahead and make a demonstration real quick. So I'll go ahead and put another one here, but I'll rotate it, so that way they're kind of moving in opposite directions. And when I play it, you'll see Alright, well I kind of jumped when they weren't moving, but you get the idea, right? So you have to jump from platform to platform, and they kind of move, whatever. And it can be kind of tricky in an obby if it's like actually well made and not like made like how I made it. But so that's pretty much how I did that. Well, I didn't explain how I did that. I don't know why I said that, but I'm gonna ask you to make pretty much this right now. So this does actually have a script inside of it, kind of controlling it a little bit, helping it out. But I'm going to ask you to pretty much make this. You kind of have a visual as to what you're supposed to do. I kind of already spoiled it a little bit, but I'll go ahead and suggest that you try and make something like this on your own. Good luck. It's not too complicated. Something you might have noticed, if you want a hint real quick, is when I use linear velocity, and also when I use rigidity enabled on this, you can see the parts actually kind of rotate freely. And that's because obviously linear velocity and align position are just controlling the part's position. It's not controlling their orientation. So you might want to use one of the other movers we went over to kind of control its orientation, so it doesn't kind of rotate like a crazy wiggle wobbly noodle play thing, whatever, right? So I'm gonna go over how I made it now, and I hope that you try to make it on your own. If you failed, you know, it happens, but it's always a great learning experience to try and make things on your own. So I'm gonna go over this now. So you can see I got a few things here. I got end pause and I got start pause, and you can see each one of these actually has an attachment inside of them. And then I also got the platform itself, which has a line orientation, a line position, and its core attachment, which is obviously the attachment for the platform. So line position by default is set up to have attachment 1, so which is the starting position, and then a line orientation is just set up to use attachment 1. So what it's doing really is just maintaining its current orientation. So it's making sure that it doesn't rotate or anything like that using a line orientation. So it's aligning its orientation to itself, which is pretty much just keeping it in place kind of thing. So you can see we got our start pause and our end pause. So now our script isn't too complicated, right? All I got inside of the script here is a debounce. The debounce is controlling our run service. You could just use a while true do loop, but those are kind of smelly. Nobody wants to use those. So run service, a lot cooler. Everybody loves run service, right? So I just got a reference to our platform to make the script not too messy. I could have made some more references, but I got kind of lazy, so whatever. So I got a debounce here. So we're checking to see if our debounce is greater than our current time, and if it is, then we just return. So that pretty much ends the thread right there, or the function. And then what we do is we take the debounce and we set it, and this is pretty much if the debounce is greater than our current time. So if it is, then we'll continue, and we'll take our debounce and we'll set it to os.clock plus 2.5 seconds. So pretty much every 2.5 seconds the platform will switch attachments, and that's actually what we're doing next here. This is kind of I don't know, there's probably a better way to do this. I didn't want to go like too crazy here, but what I got is an if statement, and we take its align positions attachment 1, because that's the goal attachment, right? That's the position that we want to move it to, and we check if its name is equal to A1. And if you remember, A1 is the attachment inside of the starting position. And if it is, let me go back in the script. If it is, then we change it to A2, which is the end positions attachment. So that pretty much like switches it, right? And then otherwise, we'll just switch it back to the start positions attachment. So it pretty much just switches the attachment every 2.5 seconds. Not too complicated, right? So there's obviously quite a few things you could do with this. Obviously, platform is one of them. One of the things you have to keep in mind is your platform has to be big enough to kind of influence the player's mass or whatever. I remember when I was trying to make this right before the video, I was like, why isn't this working? I couldn't figure it out. And the reason was the platform was just too small. I had to make it bigger because it was too small to influence the player pretty much. But you can make a few things like this. Another thing I've made using constraints like this is a coin, and it kind of has like a little hover effect. It bounces up and down, and it kind of rotates with angular velocity. And then another thing also is like a little tool giver, where like the item kind of like hovers in the air and spins, and when you walk into it you pick up the tool kind of thing. You know, those kind of things can all be done with this, which is a lot easier than trying to like use tween service. You know, you look at this at first and think it's a tween service, but using constraints like this can be a lot simpler than tween service a lot of times. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I don't really have much to go over in the beginner series. I wasn't really planning on going over these, but I just recently felt like learning them, so I learned them, and I felt like making a video on them, so I did, because this is kind of some important things. They're pretty useful, especially for things like even like VFX and obbies, whatever, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. Bye.